population. So I think this is a timely, and I'm glad Maggie put this together, timely opportunity to start talking about HPAI, and it creeps closer and closer to us. So thanks, Maggie, for letting me talk.
Thanks, Don. I really appreciate USDA's partnership on this, not only in response, but in all of our preparedness activities, along with CSU. We do have some other folks on from other agencies. Dr. Jennifer House from CDPHE is on and available. As we know, this is a zoonotic disease, and she's available for any public health questions that may come up throughout the webinar. Our wildlife services and Colorado Parks and Wildlife folks were very busy, so they were not able to attend today, but if there are any wildlife specific questions, we'll be sure to get them answered and find answers for you as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Becky Hoffman, who's our logistics extraordinaire, and she's going to walk through some logistics of using this platform and just a few housekeeping items. Becky?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. First off, we will be recording the webinar, and it will be posted hopefully within the next week or so on our website. We will be sending a follow-up email to indicate where you can find that recording. This is the Google Meet platform, and if you are not familiar with it, let me just kind of go around the screen. You've got your controls at the bottom, and one of those controls is the closed caption. If you prefer to have the closed caption turned on during the meeting, you can click that and it turns right on. It works very quick and very easy. If you would like to ask a question, we ask that you use the chat box, and you can find the chat over to the right, and it's the little talk icon or message icon in the middle of the 5 icons at the right there. And that just works better. Number one, it records everything, and we can see that after the fact, make sure we got everything answered. Number two, everyone else can see what the answers are, and we can answer it right away. If you use the Q&A, we cannot answer that right away without stopping the presentation and answering the question at that time. So again, please use the chat feature to ask questions. That is also where you will find the link to the certificate of attendance towards the end of the webinar. I will be posting it in there, and you can click on that and enter your information to get that certificate of attendance. And I think that is all I have. Back to you, Maggie.
Great. Thank you so much, Becky. Hopefully we're on a technology platform, and sometimes there's issues, but we'll work through those as they come up. So we are also planning to send a post-webinar email with all of the resources that we talk about today. We at CDA have been working on updating our website and adding some of our new resources on there. So we'll be adding that to a post-webinar email. So the agenda for today, we have this agenda was put together primarily for our commercial producers and our veterinarians in the state. And so we're going to cover a lot of topics, and some of you have a really great understanding of these topics, and some may not. So this is really to just get everybody on the same page with highly pathogenic avian influenza and all of the resources that we're going to walk through. So first, I'll give an overview of HPAI, the disease, and what the current status is, a brief sit-rep at the end as far as the current cases across the U.S. And then Dr. Pavlonia from CSU will talk about avian influenza diagnostic testing. Dave Dice from CDA is going to walk through secure food supply, what it takes to become secure food supply producer, and why it's important, especially in the face of an outbreak. Heather Ryder from CSU is going to go through the NPIP, the National Poultry Improvement Plan program, and talk about the CSU Avian Health Team and the resources they have available. Morgan McCarty, Dr. McCarty is our new assistant state veterinarian at CDA, and she'll go through biosecurity. It's all about biosecurity right now, and I think everybody on this call knows that, but go through some of the best management practices. And we do have a really good representation of our commercial producers on the line right now as well. And so we'd also welcome any open discussion and thoughts that anybody can provide at that time on best biosecurity practices that you all are implementing. And then we'll conclude with Dr. Lomkin. Dr. Richanne Lomkin is our Northeast area field veterinarian, and she's going to walk through kind of what to expect during a HPAI investigation. Really walk through the whole investigation process and give you an idea of what the best next steps are going to be if you end up in an investigation. So that's a brief overview of what the webinar today is going to look like. I'm going to pause real quick. And Becky, while we go through the reminders, if you want to launch that poll, so in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a little icon that should pop up with a notification when the poll is launched. And just to get an idea of who we all have on the call, I know we had a really good number of commercial producers and veterinarians signed up. We may have other poll questions throughout the webinar. We don't have any pre-planned for this webinar, but we might come up with some on the fly. So just a few reminders, keep yourself on mute. And again, you can find mute on the bottom of your screen. Type your questions into the chat box. I typed in the chat box, you should see a little notification or icon pop up where that chat box is. And if you do want to ask a question or discussion verbally, please use the raise your hand, just in case we have a number of people at the same time. Raise your hand at the very bottom of the screen. And to reserve bandwidth for our folks like me, where we have poor internet connection, keep your video off unless you're speaking, and that'll just help conserve bandwidth as we go through. So I'm going to pause real quick and see, Becky, were you able to launch that poll? Great.
I did. It looks like we've only got 13 votes so far. Okay. So if you look in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see where you can find that poll. And if we can get everybody to answer, we got 14 votes and 65 attendees. So we'd like to see that number increase just a bit.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Becky. Any questions before we get started? Okay. I thought just to set the stage so everybody understands what the Colorado poultry industry looks like. And nobody knows this better than our commercial poultry producers. But we've got a lot of other entities on the line. So just to give you an overview, this is a report that just came out recently from the NASS Rocky Mountain Regional Office. And this is the report from 2021. What did the commercial poultry industry look like in Colorado? So we had 5.12 million layers in Colorado that produced 1.5 billion eggs in 2021. And for total chickens, and that includes our breeder broiler operations, is 6.2 million total chickens and a value of 21.9 million. And from 2017, this is NASS 2017 data, Colorado ranked number 15 in egg production. We do have some other poultry and bird industries in Colorado, some other sectors, and of course, a pretty large number of backyard poultry, exhibition poultry and birds, some niche markets and specialty birds across the state, and waterfowl and game birds, and that includes preserves and hunting and all kinds of different sectors. So we have a commercial industry, but we have a lot of other poultry in the state as well. And so one thing that we are going to work on, this is our commercial producer webinar. We're going to be hosting one in early April that we'll start advertising soon. That'll be really for kind of all of the other sectors and what do they need to understand about highly pathogenic avian influenza and biosecurity and where we stand with the outbreak currently. So I'll dive into the HPAI overview and brief, and feel free if you have questions, type them in the chat box, and either myself after I'm done presenting or somebody else can probably answer them as I'm presenting. So as I go through this presentation, I'm going to cover the what, the so what, and the now what. So what is avian influenza? So what? Why do we care about it? And now what? What are we doing about it? And what does the current picture look like? So first, what is avian influenza? So The virus, it's an avian influenza virus. I think everybody knows that. And classification of avian influenza viruses is based on subtype surface antigens. And there's 2, hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. And historically, there's been 16 H's and 9 N's. And now some new science and data has shown us that there's 18 H's and 11 N's. And so when we hear about H5N1 or H7N3, those types of things, that's what this means. It's those surface antigens that are on the surface of the virus itself. And that helps us distinguish what type of virus it is as well. So there's over 130 influenza subtypes identified in nature, and most in avian species. So again, a reminder that avian influenza, depending on the subtype, can be zoonotic. And that's why it's really important that we engage our public health partners and everybody understands the precautions that you all should be taking in the field with suspected cases. So when we talk about AI, there's different subtypes. There's highly pathogenic avian influenza and there's low pathogenic avian influenza. So high path AI, which is primarily what we're going to be talking about today, is the disease that causes severe disease in poultry. It's the virus that causes severe disease in poultry. And that contains subtypes H5 or H7. So high path AI is always H5 or H7. Low path AI typically causes mild disease in poultry, and it can contain all of the other H subtypes, including non-high path AI, H5 and H7. And one of the important things to be aware of is even if we have a low path H5 or H7, that can mutate into highly pathogenic avian influenza. So it's important that we respond to those low path cases as well as the high path cases. Influenza A reservoirs. So our waterfowl and shorebirds typically serve as our natural reservoirs for influenza A, and they carry all known H and N antigens in all kinds of different combinations. And the predominant subtype that we see circulating can change periodically, and we see that through surveillance. So in the North American flyways, we've heard a lot about this recently. These are the north to south seasonal movements between breeding grounds and wintering areas for those waterfowl and shorebirds. And in North America, we have 4 flyways. So on the right-hand side of your screen is the black, the Atlantic, and then next to that, blue is Mississippi, green is Central, where we're primarily located, although we do overlap a little bit with the red, which is Pacific. And you can see, up north that there's a lot of commingling across these different North American flyways. But this is what wildlife services and our wildlife agencies target their surveillance against, and helps us see the movement of avian influenza as well. And global picture is even more complex for flyways. So high path AI transmission, of course, direct transmission with infected birds, and that can be waterfowl, shorebirds, migratory birds. It can be our directly infected domestic poultry. So direct transmission is important to know about and to mitigate. But we also see indirect, so mechanical transmission of disease via people, vehicles, equipment, fomites of all kinds can also transmit this disease. So there's a lot of things that have to be taken into consideration when we talk about biosecurity. And I'm not going to touch much on biosecurity because Dr. McCarty is going to be covering that in a little bit. Morbidity and mortality. So in domestic poultry, high path AI can reach morbidity and mortality of 90 to 100%. So we know it's a pretty significant disease, and we've certainly seen that in the outbreaks so far in the United States. In wild birds, as a reminder, typically asymptomatic with the exception of H5N1, which is what's circulating right now. Clinical signs for high path AI, it is a systemic disease. So we see sudden death, can see neurologic signs, depression, anorexia, ruffled feathers, swollen cones and cyanotic cones, conjunctivitis and respiratory signs. It is clinically indistinguishable from virulent Newcastle disease. So it's important that we do diagnostic testing to rule in or rule out either of those. The other things we'll talk about a little bit more at the end of the presentation, when we get a picture of what it's looking like right now in the outbreaks, is the production parameters to monitor. And HPAI, we can see decreased water and feed consumption. And in our commercial producers, commercial facilities that are monitoring those production parameters, it's really important to note decrease in both water and feed consumption, and then also a decrease in egg production. So what? So why do we care about HPAI? I think I already painted that picture a little bit, but it is a devastating, highly contagious, and deadly foreign animal disease. So it's a foreign animal disease. It impacts animal health and welfare. It also has a significant economic impact to our producers, to the communities, and to the economy. And there's a lot of downstream effects when we deal with a foreign animal disease outbreak. There is no treatment or approved vaccination strategy for HPAI, and the only control measure that we have is depopulation of affected flocks. There's also many potential routes of entry into our domestic poultry operations. So, there's a lot of concern surrounding this disease, and we'll talk about today some of the best practices we can do to try and mitigate that. I wanted to mention the 2014-2015 HPAI outbreak. This is the largest, or was the largest, foreign animal disease outbreak in United States history, and it impacted 211 commercial premises and 21 backyard premises, with a total impact to 43 million layers and 7.4 million turkeys either died or were depopulated from HPAI. There were $850 million in direct obligations from USDA, and that's things like indemnity and compensation. So we talk about economic impact, it can be quite significant. And so I just wanted to put some of these numbers up here because this was the largest foreign animal disease outbreak we have seen in the US. There were $1.6 billion in direct loss from the turkey and egg-laying hens that had to be depopulated. And when we look at accounting for factors in, future population, lost production, the impact was thought to be closer to $3.3 billion. So pretty significant economic impact. We have had other cases of HPAI in the United States since that time that have been pretty small and managed pretty quickly. In Indiana in 2016, there was one premises with H7N8. 2017 in Tennessee, there was a small outbreak. And then 2020, North and South Carolina had some affected premises with both high path and low path. And really just wanted to highlight this epidemiologic analysis that USDA did of that 2020 North and South Carolina outbreak. And it was really interesting to me to see this depiction of the connections between these commercial facilities. So each of these lines represents some different type of connection, and you can see on the bottom what those are. So feed, garbage hauler, grower, manure hauler, propane delivery, renderer, flock supervisor, and litter source. There's a lot of potential touch points, a lot of potential movement across those lines of separation that enter the premises that have contact with many other commercial premises. So this is really important that we address all of these different potential routes of introduction in biosecurity plans. So then now what are we doing about HPAI, and what does the current picture look like? So what do we do in general, right? We watch our global trends. We see what's happening with HPAI circulating globally. We saw, in winter of 2021, it was eerily similar to what we saw in winter of 2014. And just more and more circulating globally presents a risk to us, and we get our outreach and we start planning for potential outbreaks in the US. We start planning and talking with our commercial producers and backyard facilities to increase biosecurity. We did have a HPAI tabletop exercise in June of 2021, and some of our commercial facilities did participate in that. It was more a communications-based exercise, walking through what happens when we have an investigation. So Dr. Lonkin's going to talk about that at the end, but it gave us a lot of really good next steps to take. And we are hosting an exercise next week with us at CDA and USDA partners to talk a little bit more next steps. So after communications, after our initial investigation, what does logistics planning look like? What does it look like for depopulation and disposal and all of the things that we want to have in place? And how can we take some of the lessons learned from not just the current outbreak, but previous outbreaks and apply them to our planning and preparedness activities? We do have state response plans in place, and I'll talk about that in a second. We have an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding with the Eastern Colorado Incident Management Team, that if we have a case of a foreign animal disease outbreak, we would pull them in to help us get started on an incident and an event. And we would set up a joint IMT and incident management team with our USDA partners. So we can all be at the table on those policy decision making, make sure we're doing all the right things at the right times. What are the state response plans that we have? So we have a number of them. Poultry specific, we have an initial state containment and response plan, and this is specifically for low path H5 and H7. So if we catch a low path H5, H7 before it mutates into high path, what are our response? What are our options for response in that instance? So we have that plan. We're currently still waiting in line for USDA final approval, but we have a draft plan ready to go. We also have our poultry emergency response plan, and this covers both high path AI and virulent Newcastle disease. And this was a draft from 2017. We've worked on trying to modify and make changes, and I think we'll definitely have updates and changes to make this year. USDA is working on updating their USDA Red Book, and that includes some changes that have come down from OIE, the World Organization for Animal Health. We also have a secure food supply plan, and all of our commercial folks have heard me talk about secure food supply plans, I think, since 2017. I've presented at our Colorado Ag Producers meeting annually on secure food supply plans. So in the face of an outbreak, how do we continue to safely move product in a low risk manner? And Dave Dice is going to be talking about that in a little bit. We also have the State Emergency Operations Center. I think everybody in Colorado learned what the State Emergency Operations Center was during COVID-19 as they activated jointly with CDPHE for the COVID-19 response. So we also have an annex with the state EOC in the event of a foreign animal disease outbreak. This Food and Ag Incident Annex walks through each of the different state agency responsibilities in the event of that. So this is just a brief snapshot of what the high path AI response looks like. There's a lot of steps in response. And Dr. Lomkin's going to talk a little bit about some of those initial steps. And we're not going to get too far into this response structure because we'd need almost a whole webinar just on this to walk through all of the different steps. But I do think some of this planning is stuff that we'll have some direct outreach with our producers on as well. When we think about response, a few of the key pieces of that response is depopulation, disposal, and decontamination. We call it the 3D response, and you can actually order 3D response teams from USDA to help in these response efforts. And I just wanted to touch on one of these, and that's depopulation. So I think this is, it's a challenging subject. It's a challenging disease to deal with, truly. But depopulation is something that comes up, and we get asked the question, why do you have to depopulate for highly pathogenic avian influenza? And there's a few reasons. One, of course, is it's a disease of high morbidity and high mortality. So usually these birds get sick very quickly, and they die very quickly from the disease. A lot of times just sudden death. So there's no treatment and no approved vaccine strategy. So really the only method of control that we have is to eliminate the virus, and depopulation is the means to do that. Producers are also not indemnified for dead birds. So one way we can help producers, and USDA works on this, is we try to get inventory and indemnity done quickly because as more birds die, the producers do not get indemnity for those. So Dr. Lomkin is going to touch a little bit more on that as well. And then, of course, the goal for depopulation, like I mentioned, is virus containment. The quicker we can depopulate, the quicker we can contain the virus and disease transmission. So the goal, USDA's response goal for depopulation is 24 to 48 hours after confirmation of disease. So USDA is also working on a lot of things, and all of the things I've already mentioned, we also work with USDA on that. So Dr. Beckett and I work very closely on our state response plans. He works very closely with the national coordination group, but USDA does a lot of things as well. So they set import restrictions from infected countries. Wildlife Services does surveillance of wild birds. And Dr. Beckett reached out to our Colorado Wildlife Services folks recently and asked about their surveillance plan. I'll let him touch on that if he's got any clarification on what that surveillance plan or if it's started in our state yet. The H5, H7 control program, of course, we do training for disease recognition, not only for our accredited veterinarians, but producers and state animal health officials as well. And then, like I mentioned, they are working on updating some of their response and guidance documents. There's always something, lessons learned that we can take and apply to future outbreaks. And they're working on updating some of those as we speak. So where are we right now? Global trends. Like I said, one of the things that we watch is global trends. So in winter 2021, we saw HPAI circulating globally. December 20th, HPAI was detected in Newfoundland, and that was in the Atlantic Flyway on that right-hand side in the Black Flyway. January 14th, HPAI was detected in the United States in wild birds in South Carolina, and subsequently detected in commercial poultry in Indiana on February 8th. And I put together a couple of maps of where we are right now. So there's been detections across, this is commercial and backyard detections. And I actually probably should change this to say poultry and non-poultry detections. They recently updated the OIE definitions for poultry and non-poultry. But these, states across the Midwest and the eastern states is where we've had those detections. And this was updated as of yesterday. And the 2022 wild bird detections had mostly been in eastern states, but we got a notice yesterday from the Nebraska State Veterinarian that they did have a detection in a wild bird, and that press release went out, I believe, late yesterday afternoon. So that was, like I said, updated. I just updated that today after we received that press release. So what next? What are we asking our producers to do? So increase biosecurity. That's the biggest thing. How do we keep and protect our Colorado poultry industry? Biosecurity, biosecurity, biosecurity. And Dr. McCarty is going to talk about that and talk about our best practices. Monitoring production parameters is another really important thing. And we learned this during the last outbreak, but it's been highlighted more again during these current outbreaks and current detections. So monitoring production parameters, I'll talk about just in a minute as well. But Indiana reported, for instance, in their first turkey facility, there was an 85% drop in water consumption in their first detection. In one of their subsequent detections, it was a 50% drop in water production or water consumption. So those are really important to monitor, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then report. I'll talk about who do you report to when you see something and you suspect something. The other really important thing is going to be site-specific planning. And I've talked to some of our commercial producers already, and you guys are on this. You're working on depopulation and disposal plans. Nobody knows your facilities better than you do. Nobody knows what logistics are going to work in your facilities better than you do. We can provide support. We can provide folks that can help you work on those plans. And of course, in the event of a HPAI detection, we'll be there actively helping. But the best way we can do it right and do it well is to plan ahead of time. And that is one of the components of secure egg supply is site-specific planning. And we are available as resources. USDA has a lot of resources as well, but that's the way we're going to get this done and get it done well. So production parameters, what should you be monitoring and what's abnormal, right? So feed consumption, water consumption, egg production, and mortality. Those are all key indicators. And I really tried to look for USDA published data on what the trigger point is for each of these. There's a little bit, but there's not any really specific. So I did find some new primary literature articles that have been posted over the last few years that have some key indicators. So feed and water consumption, here's a few. that were sort of target. So drop, and I will link these articles at the end as well, so you guys can take a look at these articles and kind of apply that to your premises. But these are just some of the parameters to watch. Drop in mean daily feed larger than 7 grams, water intake 14 mils, and that was for a specific population. So how do you apply that to a whole commercial production facility? Like I said, Indiana, the 85% and 50% drop in water consumption, really it's all knowing your normal. What's your normal, and what's going to be your trigger for your operation that says something's going on. Might not be high PathAI, but it might be something else, and something's going on and we need to figure it out. Egg production, and this was from one of the articles that I found, a trigger of 2% drop in egg production along with mortality indicators. And you know, sometimes that might be a false indicator. Like I said, it might not be high PathAI, but it might be. And so at what point do you report that? Mortality, really the key here was having a moving average threshold that you would implement on your farm. So when you say, here's our normal daily mortality, and this is going to be our trigger that says something else is going on, and we're going to call in and get some diagnostics. So again, know your normal, know what your daily production is, know what your daily production parameters are, and know when you're going to call. And then who do you call? Is another great question. So of course, the state veterinarian's office at the Department of Agriculture, that's our main number, 303-869-9130. You can call that 24 hours a day. If you get that number after hours, if you get the voicemail, it will indicate which veterinarian is on call. We have veterinarians on call 24 hours a day. The CSU Avian Health Team, Heather is going to talk about that as well. And that is not answered on night and weekends typically. So, you know, it might not be monitored if you call after hours or on the weekends. And then the USDA Healthy Bird Hotline, that number goes directly to Dr. Beckett's office. And Dr. Beckett just put his cell phone number in the chat as well. Thank you, Dr. Beckett, for that. Okay, so any questions for me? And I'm going to go to the next slide as well. That has our primary office number as well as my cell phone. That's my direct cell phone, and feel free to reach out anytime. Pause and see if there's any questions. And if there are no questions, then I am going to stop sharing and we can move to Dr. Pablonia. And if there are any questions, drop them in the chat and I can answer them in there as well.
Hello, everybody. Hang on one second. I'm working on my screen share. Yeah, that's weird. Dave, I don't know if you can help out. It only wants to share my entire screen. It won't share my presentation. I don't know if you can just pull up my presentation slides instead, because the entire screen then does that weird mirroring thing.
Okay. Yeah, give me 1 second.
Okay. I'll just start chatting while we talk about that. So my name is Christy Pablonia. I'm a veterinary microbiologist here at the Colorado State University Veterinary Diagnostic Lab. We have 3 labs. Our main lab is in Fort Collins. That's where I'm located and where I'm at right now. And then we have 2 branch labs, one in Grand Junction, Colorado, and then one in Rocky Ford, Colorado. So if you are needing to submit samples, you can submit them to any of the labs and they'll come up here to Fort Collins for testing. We do offer a full host of influenza virus testing services, not just for poultry, but for all species. And we offer lots of different tests, everything from antibody tests, real-time PCR, virus isolation, and sequencing. So we have quite a lot of capabilities. I'm only going to talk today about the capabilities that we use specifically, thanks, Dave, for avian influenza virus testing. And this is just a picture of our biosafety level 3 lab and a couple of our microbiology technicians working in the laboratory doing diagnostic testing. And when there are high PathAI outbreaks, we typically are working at BSL3 level conditions because of the zoonotic nature of some high PathAI viruses. Okay, next slide. Again, we offer a lot of different tests. I'm only going to kind of talk about 2 categories of tests here. So one would be the antibody test that we use. And we use these tests for general surveillance. So if you're part of the NPIP program on the commercial side, these are most likely the tests you're going to be using. The reason we use these are because antibodies are long-lived. So if poultry or birds are exposed to avian influenza virus, any avian influenza virus, and they're either well, typically they're exposed via infection, so they get infected, or they've been vaccinated, which, as you heard previously from Dr. Baldwin, vaccination would require approval, and we don't vaccinate against high PathAI viruses here in the US. So that would not be typical, and we don't ever see that. But either of those conditions, infection or vaccination, can cause antibodies to develop, and those antibodies are long-lived and can be detectable for months to years after infection. And that varies a little bit by bird species and by the type of virus that they're exposed to, but they are very long-lived, which is why we use them for surveillance. We typically run one of 3 tests. Most commonly, we're using Agar gel immunodiffusion, or ELISA, enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. We only use hemagglutination inhibition, that's HI, for subtyping. So if we wanted to figure out if it's, for example, an H5 virus versus an H3 virus, we can use that test, but we don't use it that often here in Fort Collins because typically that is done by the National Veterinary Services Lab in Ames, Iowa. The pictures you see here are of the Agar gel immunodiffusion test, and it's a great classic test that's easy to set up and used widely around the US. And again, used for the NPIP program extensively. ELISA is also used. And we can take samples, so the commercial operations will send us blood samples that we'll centrifuge here for serum, or they'll send us the actual serum fraction of the blood, and then we'll set it up in these Agar gel plates, and we'll put in known controls that are antigens, so parts of the virus, and then other known antibodies. And when those two the antigen and antibody, when those 2 factors meet up in the gel, they precipitate out. So you see these little lines here, and that's how we read it. It's just kind of an interesting test because people always want to know what the tests look like. So there's a little picture on the bottom where you see some lines in between the holes, the wells, and that's just the antigen antibody interface. And where you don't see that line of demarcation, so that line of precipitation, that would be a negative antibody. So that's just kind of a for fun picture of an EGID test. Okay, next slide. The other test that we use a lot of is real-time PCR testing, and we use this test to detect the virus itself. So it detects nucleic acid, so like RNA, DNA. In influenza virus, what we're looking for is the viral RNA. It's an RNA virus. And so this detects current shedding. So it detects a bird that's currently shedding virus. And depending on the bird species and the influenza subtype, and whether it's high pathogenic or low pathogenic, that will dictate what sample we collect. So in poultry, typically those birds will shed virus via respiratory secretion. So we're typically taking oropharyngeal or tracheal swabs. And then in wild birds, they also shed virus through their fecal secretions. So for example, right now in the USDA Wild Bird Surveillance Program, they're actually taking an oropharyngeal swab and a cloacal swab from each bird, and then they'll pool those in one tube. So just make sure you know, if you are a commercial operation and you're collecting samples, make sure you're touching base with us at the laboratory or with whatever vet you're working with from CDA or USDA to ensure that you're taking the correct sample types. Typically, again, for poultry, that's almost always going to be an oropharyngeal swab sample in a specific media, so we do provide that media to our to all of the operations that we work with. We also use PCR testing widely for backyard birds because we are looking for those viral outbreaks, so we're looking for viral shedding. So if you have ever seen us at an auction or a fair or other poultry event, typically what we're doing is we're taking oropharyngeal swabs, so mouth swabs, and sticking them in this specific media, and then we bring them back to the lab for real-time PCR testing. The way real-time PCR testing works is it's a test that's designed to amplify the viral RNA that's present in the sample. And we use multiple cycles of heating and cooling that then cycle through and amplify the virus. And there's a little picture in the right-hand corner showing what that looks like. So all of those samples where you see the lines that are increasing that's exponential amplification of RNA virus, of specifically avian influenza virus. And we can design the test to detect all influenza viruses or specific subtypes of the virus, or even specific clades of the virus. And then if that amplification crosses a threshold, which is that green horizontal line, then we know that the sample is positive. And that's why sometimes on your reports, when you see us result out, we'll say the sample is negative, the result is negative, and it'll say CT value 0.00. That means that there was no amplification. So if it was positive, you would see a CT value of something like 25.4, but you would never see that because when we get a positive, that always has to be confirmed by our national lab, and it gets sent to the state vet's office in the USDA. And so you would be hearing from them, not directly from us at the lab. The only time you're hearing from us at the lab is when you're doing your general surveillance and we're resulting out negative results. Okay, next slide. We also offer full necropsy and histopathology services. And so we do get a lot of, especially, both. We get submissions from backyard flocks. We sometimes get submissions from commercial flocks. So if you have any mortality or unusual clinical signs, we certainly would encourage you to contact us for necropsy services. Now, if it is consistent with avian influenza virus, we're also going to notify the USDA or and Colorado Department of Agriculture so that they know that we've got a case there that we're working on, and potentially, depending on what the case looks like, they may want to do their own investigation on the case. So we kind of provide a lot of general necropsy services because there are a lot of chickens who die for a lot of different reasons, and so we're just generally diagnosing disease all the time in poultry, not just chickens, but all poultry here at the CSU Vet Lab. And just the picture in the bottom right-hand corner is just another pathology picture. I know Dr. Baldwin showed you a few in her slides. And here's one. This is a loop of duodenum. And the top section of the duodenum, in between the loop of the duodenum, is pancreas. And that pancreas in the top picture is healthy and normal. And then in the bottom picture, there's a lot of hemorrhage and edema and necrosis. And that's a sign of highly pathogenic avian influenza. So there have been times where diagnosticians are necropsying birds that they don't expect to be positive for avian influenza virus or particularly highly pathogenic avian influenza virus. And because of the lesions that we see in the body of the bird during necropsy, that would alert us to a concern about avian influenza. And then we'd collect further samples, test those, and also work with our National Vet Services Lab and work with the USDA and CDA. So there's a lot of routes that you could send samples to us that would result in us detecting and notifying others about a potential concern if we were concerned about avian influenza virus. Okay, next slide. And then just the last little tidbit I'll talk about is just how the lab system works. So we work under the NALN, the National Animal Health Laboratory Network. This is the USDA's lab network, which is used to detect various foreign animal and emerging diseases. And this chart's a little busy because it shows a few different NALN labs on here. There's just over 50 NALN labs. And all the little different shapes signify different tests that they can run. And to be part of the NALN program, you have to have a lot of different qualifications as far as your laboratory qualifications, quality management qualifications. You have to have staff that are correctly proficiency trained to do these tests. You have to have specific SOPs and SOP structures available. And you have to be approved by the USDA. So we're approved as a tier 1, that's the top tier lab in Fort Collins. And then the branch lab, one of our branch labs in Rocky Ford is available for testing for foot and mouth disease and classical swine fever. So that's why you see those icons there for Rocky Ford. If we get any positives for any of these diseases, we will always send samples to the National Veterinary Services Labs. Depending on the disease, they'll either go to the Ames, Iowa lab or the Plum Island lab. In addition to that, if there's ever an outbreak or concern that the CDA or USDA are working on, so they're working on some sort of investigation, they may either just send samples directly to the National Vet Services Labs, or they may split the samples and send a part of the sample to us, part of the sample to the NVSL labs for detection. And at our lab, because these are foreign animal diseases, as I mentioned before, we only report negatives generally. Any positive would always have to be confirmed by the National Vet Services Lab, and they'll do further testing on it and typically sequencing, and they'll work up do all of the diagnostic workup on those cases. As far as our capacity, we can pretty easily test more than 1,000 samples a day. For the past 2 years, we've been responding to the COVID pandemic, and we've tested as a maximum about 7,500 samples a week, which is a lot of samples if you've ever looked at 7,500. So we have a really very good capacity here in Colorado. And then throughout the null network, when you multiply that by the more than 50 labs in the null network, we have a rather robust diagnostic testing capacity for viruses like avian influenza virus. So I will wrap up with that. And then I know we've got other speakers on the line. One of them is going to be Heather Ryder, our Avian Health Program Coordinator. She's going to tell you a little bit more about how these samples come to us through different methods like general surveillance and through NPIP. So happy to take any questions at any time. You guys can always just shoot me an email or call the CSU Vet Lab and just ask for someone on the poultry team, and you'll get either me or Heather or one of our team members.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Pavlonia. We greatly appreciate all the work that you do at the diagnostic lab and your expertise in avian health. It comes in very, very handy for all of us in Colorado. So next up is Dave Dice with CDA, and he's going to go through secure food supply planning.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Dave. I'm the Animal Incident Management Specialist here at the State Veterinarian's Office. And I'm going to give you a broad overview of secure food supply and what's involved with that, what's included, and why a plan would be a good idea to have developed before there's ever a disease outbreak for your business or location. So the secure food supply, the idea, it's a nationwide idea, and the main goal is to maintain continuity of business throughout the agricultural industry throughout the nation in the event of a foreign animal disease is ever identified within the United States. So while I'm talking about in the broad aspect secure food supply, each commodity has its own website, which you see here at the bottom of the screen. Each commodity has its own website that's geared towards their individual, species, livestock entity, and they're great resources for. They're great resources to allow you to craft and generate your own plan that's unique to your facility and your premises. They have draft template biosecurity plans that you can download and then set up for your site. And it's very simple. You just go through, you input your own personal details, your own site details, and then you coordinate it and draft that to meet your unique situation. So what we did here in Colorado in the past year, we created our own Colorado-centric secure food supply plan that we have available on our website. So what this is, in a general sense, we brought together all the basics from all of the plans and unified that in a way that is broad. It covers everything. It covers how Colorado would respond to a plan, what our outline would be, what our plan would be. And then the main goals that we wanted to come from this were to provide a planning, prevention, and response apparatus for any FAD outbreaks, and then with the ultimate goal to minimize disease spread. And then for producers, it's to aid you in developing a solid biosecurity, surveillance, and then aid with data management practices. And then along with this comes the permitting requirements, which I'll get to in a little bit in more detail. But with the disease outbreak, the movement is going to be limited and restricted, and it's going to be there's the need for permitting to allow movement in certain areas. So to allow for this managed movement in the event of an outbreak, this plan will help with that as well. And then there's also resources and training materials to support. So this covers all the commodities and is a resource for you, and it provides details such as, Colorado's particular individual people that they need to contact information throughout the state for our offices, and then how we would respond. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what goes into the actual secure food supply plan. So at your location, you would develop your own plan. As I mentioned, the commodity specific websites, you can download a template for creating your own biosecurity plan. So you create a plan at your business, your premises, and then you provide that to us. We would review that, and then we provide feedback or maybe ask questions. And then once it's finalized, that is your plan to use in the event of a disease outbreak. And then we would have that on file as well. So we would maintain that within our database. So the main components involved with the secure food supply, it's an enhanced site biosecurity plan. You would have a designated biosecurity manager, and their job would be to maintain the plan and also to provide training for employees. There's a site map. I'll go over that in the next slide in more detail. That designates a perimeter buffer area with a defined line of separation for your premises. And then there's also the surveillance component. As mentioned, the caretaker observation, which includes, we talked about tracking daily feed, water consumption, and there's also the diagnostic testing component. And then what all of this wraps up to and leads to is to getting to that ability to have permitted managed movements of live poultry or poultry products out of designated control areas. And I'll get to more on the permitted movement and how those designated control areas look in a little bit. So here's an example of what a premises site map would look like. And again, the commodity specific websites, they do a great job of walking you through how you can go to Google Maps, get to the satellite image of your premises, and then how you can edit that and create these site maps that you would provide with your specific biosecurity plan to us. So in this, you're going to identify your perimeter buffer area, your line of separation, and then your designated parking areas and vehicle movements on and off the property. And then finally, the permitted movement. So Dr. Lumpkin's going to talk about this, but let's say in the event of a disease outbreak, the infected premises, that's where the disease is occurring. That's where it's been identified. And so from that disease event, we will work with USDA and we will develop a control area. So any entities, any businesses or premises that fall within that control area, their movement will be limited in the sense that they will have to request using, I have here an example, we would provide an emergency permit to move form that you would need to complete to initiate any movement. So that in hand with your secure food supply plan that you have in place, that will be your key to getting movement going sooner. And that's where we get to the primary takeaways from this. It's the individual commodity secure food supply plans. They're your support for business continuity for poultry and livestock premises so that they can move out of affected areas, but the differentiation is that those that are infected are not moving, and then those outside of that are able to move. And we want to establish a plan prior to any disease outbreak so that we provide a basis for continued movement out of those infected areas. And that was the end of my presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave. Anybody have any questions on secure food supply planning? And we can talk about the different complexities of permitting as well. All right. Well, if people do have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box and we can hop to them at that time. So I think we're going to turn to Heather Ryder from CSU. There's Heather. Great. CSU Avian Health Team. Heather, if you want to go ahead and share your screen for your presentation.
Dave, can I do the same thing as Christy? I think I have the same problem with the share. And then I did see something show up in chat from Julia about if the secure food plans are required for indemnity in the poultry FAD outbreaks.
Yeah, so Julia, great question. While Dave shares Heather's presentation, I can answer that question. So there's two parts of, kind of continuity of business. One is the movement. So secure food supply is tied to allowing for permitted movement. What's tied to indemnity is biosecurity. And this really is under NPIP. So for all of our NPIP participants, and Heather might touch on this a little bit in her presentation, having a biosecurity plan and having your biosecurity, I don't remember if it's called a survey or Heather, what that's called, but you have to have that in place and you have to have biosecurity implemented in order to qualify for indemnity. So biosecurity is tied to indemnity from USDA, and that's a change from the 2015 outbreak, because what we saw was poor biosecurity led to a lot of disease transmission, and it led to further disease outbreak. So so they really did tie that to indemnity. So good question. All right, Heather, take it away.
Yeah, hi, I'm Heather Ryder. I am the Colorado, as Dr. Papalonia mentioned, I am the coordinator of the Avian Health Program here at Colorado State University. I was just going to talk to you guys briefly today about kind of not probably a whole lot of detail in the NPIP program. I think a lot of you are aware of it, but I'll just touch on it real quickly for those of you who aren't aware of what the NPIP program is. But I'll also kind of talk about our surveillance effort and kind of what we do. I'll give you guys a quick look at kind of how Colorado breaks down producers within our NPIP program and where we sit in Colorado. And then I have some numbers, again, on surveillance. But then kind of just to follow up on what Dr. Baldwin was saying, yes, we, every 3 years, and I believe I have that right, so we'll be coming due in I think another year and a half, we do a biosecurity audit. The NPIP has a requirement of, and I'd have to look up the exact numbers for all the different areas, but for the Colorado egg producers, which is what I know really well because that's mostly what Colorado is, anybody above 200,000 in their production has to do the biosecurity audit or kind of meet the biosecurity requirements and thereby do the audit to qualify for indemnity. Anybody below that threshold in their production, I think, unless it's changed, it still qualifies for indemnity. So there is kind of a size break there. So a lot of our big producers, all of Colorado's large producers are already enrolled in that program. And then our smaller producers, just by default, would be kind of enrolled in that program, but they don't have to necessarily meet the same standards, but we really, really highly encourage it just because it is a very good, solid biosecurity plan, and it just protects the producer from all diseases, not just AI, but again, it's a good plan. Okay, so that picture on there is just kind of us at some of our producers doing some of our biosecurity audits. That was just us dressed up in our biosecurity gear. But next page. Or next slide, I guess. Yeah, so a lot of people probably on here know what the NPIP is, but just for those of you who don't, just a quick thing. This program came about in the 1930s. There was a big outbreak of pullorum and fowl typhoid. It basically brought down the U.S. Poultry industry. And so they got together, the poultry producers at that time, academia, the federal government, and they put together the National Poultry Improvement Plan. Now, it's definitely grown since 1935. In the beginning, what it was is the hatcheries were kind of just basically disseminating this disease into the world. So they or into the United States, probably globally, but back then production facilities were a lot smaller than they are today. So the NPIP kind of was born, and then since then it's evolved, but still that foundational disease, the pullorum typhoid testing, is at the foundation. You have to qualify, you have to meet, and every subparts, and we'll talk about subparts in a minute, might have a different standard, but each in the the CFR, so the federal register, like every subpart, all the rules are listed in what they have to follow. So it just depends on what subpart you fall into and kind of what your rules are, but there's still a foundational pullorum typhoid disease program within the NPIP, and you have to meet that first. And then there are other, I think if you go to the next slide, yeah, and these are the other programs that are also available within the NPIP right now. So obviously the Salmonella pullorum and the Gallinarium, the foundation. We don't have any subparts in Colorado that participate in the mycoplasma free. We do have some backyard flocks that are either enrolling or participating in the avian influenza clean program, which requires so I should say that it's a different requirement for commercial flocks, and for our backyard flocks, they have to submit testing every 180 days. And our commercial flocks, so this is where some of our avian influenza surveillance comes in off our NPIP, they have to submit on a certain cycle depending on what they're doing with that flock. So all our commercial flocks are submitting serum into us on that schedule, and we run it here. So we get a lot of surveillance around that. And I'll give you the numbers in a minute. I can't remember what's the next slide. Oh, this is just a brief stuff. This was actually just taken directly from the website, off the NPIP website. It's just kind of why be a part of the NPIP. I mean, there is some diagnostic disease testing that comes with it, obviously really focused around pullorum, but obviously avian influenza is a big disease of concern. So too, if you're a purchaser of birds, hopefully they're meeting at least that kind of base standards. For a lot of flocks, or a lot of producers, what it allows them to do is move their birds relatively more easy than if you didn't have it, because you would either have to pay for this testing, because each state, I think all states require pullorum, and then some require some additional avian influenza testing. And so then this allows you the 9-3, so it allows you some ease with shipping your birds over state line that otherwise you have to get a CBI or other, and some states require permits in addition. So it's not that it's a perfect thing, but it helps you within that interstate movement. And then too, within Colorado, we do have a fairly, sizable, if you think about our exhibition, like we have 3 poultry shows a year, we have auctions, we have swaps, we have, we don't have a true maybe live bird market, but we have a lot of trading of poultry and parking lots, throughout the state that we try to get to, and at least get AI testing kind of outside of our normal NPIP testing. So kind of we call that our live bird market. And then even because we are the Colorado Avian Health Program, we are the NPIP, but we're also here in the diagnostic lab, as Dr. Pablonia said. So we also do a lot of just the diagnostic testing itself. So it's a really neat program in the state of Colorado to have the NPIP and kind of the other pieces of the poultry program housed here at CSU. We work really closely with our state partners, the USDA, the CDA. When we have, a poultry thing, that communication is pretty quick. We're very familiar with each other. And so that's really nice for that speed of reporting, just kind of having that, having it all kind of done in a very small group of people allows us some, I think, very quick response. So for instance, if you ended up calling me and you got me and you told me that you had a clinical case with high path coming in, it's an easy call for me, email or a call over to the Colorado Department of Ag, maybe USDA, to also let flag it to them, so then they can do kind of some additional follow-up so we can all be watching it. And we do that on other diseases here within the diagnostic lab, just kind of having that. So that makes Colorado, or at least our, I think, unique and good here in Colorado for our poultry producers. Yeah, so I guess that's kind of how we're situated here. We are just a small team, though, just so you know, within Colorado State. I have a small team. We hire vet students each year, and we have 1 to 2 kind of program specialists that help us with the program, whether that's diagnostic testing, being out in the field. So we do a lot of outreach on a very small team. Sometimes we have some challenges with just getting into the field, but we have a pretty close relationship with a lot of our poultry producers. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so this is just a quick snapshot of Colorado. This is kind of what we look like within the NPIP and our participants. Our 146B, that's kind of, I would say, size-wise and like egg production, that is our largest group, just on the sheer volume of their production. We have 27 participants that would kind of be in that category. 5 of them usually are greater than 500 to 1 million bird kind of production, so they're fairly sizable. And then we have 21 kind of in that more 10,000. Most are in the 25,000 bird barns, and I think we have 1 upwards in that 50,000 bird barn. So a lot smaller. We have 1 pullet producer who's around 200,000 birds. So you can kind of just see that size difference, but based on that, there is a lot of, this is primarily an egg production state, just based on the altitude and kind of what works here. We do have a multiplier meat breeding facility, which is fairly large. So that would be the 145C. We have 1 participant in that area. We have, this is what we kind of call our backyard flocks. And that can really range in size, our 145Es and then our 145Js. Those 2 subparts used to be joined, the game bird and the kind of exhibition hobbyist poultry. Now they've broken it out into 2 separate categories. 2 years ago, I believe that change happened. So we have 2 game bird production flocks. Now we have a lot more in Colorado, but this is who's in the actual NPIP program itself. We keep trying to get other game bird producers in it. Maybe someday we'll have more success. But our 145E, as far as the volume, we have a lot of participants in that. And we do have a lot of outreach out there within that kind of backyard flock arena. And a lot of those producers, I think are usually under anywhere from 30 birds to 300 birds is kind of where in Colorado, that's kind of the range. And then we do have 1 producer that falls both into that 145GH and kind of also a specialty producer. And so, yeah, so that's Colorado's NPIP participants. I guess next slide. I just wanted to show that this is a slide that just shows that most of the U.S. participates in the NPIP program. So it's not unique to Colorado. Obviously, a lot of poultry production on the East Coast and California on the West Coast. A little bit thinner here in the Wild West, but still a lot of production happening. But you can just see how dense and how many participants there are in the NPIP program. I think next slide. Yeah. So this is specific to us. So just to keep this in mind, this isn't a calendar year. This is a cooperative agreement year for us. And this is kind of where we sit at this point in time. We have a little bit more time on this current cooperative agreement, but this is how we kind of track our goals and what we're doing in the surveillance. So this is our commercial testing that we or NPIP testing that we do. And you can see that between our egg layers and the kind of our broiler operation, we do a lot of, we test a lot of birds annually. So this is these commercial flocks sending us samples here to the lab, usually serology, occasionally PCR, occasionally swabs. It just depends. But this is the AGID that Dr. Pabloni was talking about. This is how many samples we're doing. And this is mostly AGIDs in the commercial area. When you kind of get into the NPIP, the backyard flocks, most of that swabs. We're out at there facility doing their backyard flock inspection. We're collecting AI swabs for each of those, and we're doing the plorum testing. So there you're going to see more PCRs, but still high number of birds that, you know, because we can pool up to 11 birds in a one pool for PCR. So still overall, you know, we have a far amount of surveillance that we do, active surveillance kind of within the NPIP program in the commercial area. And then I think the next slide is the live bird market. Yeah, so this is our live bird market effort. So this is us going out to swap shows, feed stores, other kind of poultry events as they come up within the, you know, the state of Colorado. A lot of times, a lot of this work, I'll admit, is in the Front Range, kind of northern Front Range, just because it's close to us and this is where we have access. We have a little bit less influence. Obviously, the further we get down in the Pueblo area, obviously Four Corners area is probably pretty neglected by us. And then kind of Western Slope, we do have a lab over there, and we are very close with those producers over there. So we have the most reach kind of in those communities. Obviously, we're always trying to expand in other communities and trying to find ways to do that, to get the surveillance, but it is difficult when just given the size of our team. But we still do a lot. So here's what we did this year, just kind of within these events. The backyard testing necropsy, and this is kind of what I was talking about, kind of being an integrated program here at Colorado State University. Since we are the diagnostic lab and we are part of the vet teaching hospital D lab, we do get necropsies here, and we are able to grab passive surveillance on all those birds coming through necropsies. So we actually can get, and we don't charge the owners for that. That's part of our cooperative agreement, because we're always trying, because as Dr. Baldwin talked about, you know, getting on top of avian influenza is just like quick detection, and so by doing the surveillance, that's kind of that where we get that information from. Just to kind of add it all up into one kind of nice number with a bow on it, we have 8,000. We've probably done over 8,000 birds tested this year with our cooperative agreement. So I think that's fairly decent within our program, given the size of our program. I think next slide. I kind of forget if there is any more.
That's the last one.
It.
Yep.
Well, I can't remember. Yeah, so I don't know if anybody has any questions for me, or if there's anything pending about the NPIP program. But like I said, we're pretty dialed in with all of the folks, the poultry producers, and kind of our state and federal partners here in Colorado, and have a great working relationship with them. So I think there's no wrong number to call. Oh, I was going to talk about the hotline. Sorry. So we do have an avian hotline, and that's that number. It's 970-297-4008, and I can put that in the chat in a minute. But we don't monitor it on the weekends, and we do say 24 hours to, I think 72, just kind of things that change with the pandemic and staffing and stuff like that. But when it rings on my desk. It rings right here. So if I am in my office, I actually do pick it up. But if it's like after hours or on the weekend, we don't pick it up until the morning. So just so you know, that's not an immediate response phone number. And it does say it on the voicemail, and for emergencies, but unfortunately for us, I think it redirects you to the vet teaching hospital for emergencies and maybe our diagnostic lab. So that's when, if it was a weekend, you'd call the state vet's office.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Heather. Really appreciate all the work that Heather and the avian health team does. And I know you all know her very well. And I think, Richanna is going to talk about the difference between the surveillance testing, and if we had maybe potential presumptive positive on one of those surveillance testing versus, something happens and you see increased morbidity and mortality. But all of that is really important. It's important that you all know that we all work together. So if you call us, I'm going to be talking with USDA and CSU and vice versa. So Heather, thanks so much. And now I think we're going to turn it over to Dr. McCarty to talk about biosecurity. And there's a lot that goes into biosecurity, and she's going to provide kind of the high level stuff because all of it is just so premises and site specific. So thanks, Morgan.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Baldwin. I think so far we've had a ton of information on HPAI today, and like Dr. Baldwin said, I'm going to talk about biosecurity, and this is such a high-level talk on biosecurity because we could have a 2-hour webinar alone on biosecurity, especially around HPAI. So I'm going to keep it fairly high level and talk about some things that you can do site specifically, and then a really great website we'll explore in just a second. So as Dr. Baldwin mentioned at the beginning, I am Morgan McCarty. I am about 6.5 months into my new role at Colorado Department of Agriculture as the Assistant State Veterinarian. I do look forward to meeting the producers in Colorado. I just hope it's not during a HPAI outbreak. So hopefully we can get a little information from today's webinar and help keep it out of our poultry flocks here. So biosecurity, what is it? Well, I think most of you are probably practicing biosecurity every day. It's a series of management practices that are designed to keep the bad bugs out, basically. And we can't be passive about biosecurity when it comes to HPAI or really any diseases, especially foreign animal diseases. And we must be actively practicing biosecurity. And really what we know about the transmission of HPAI is going to help design our biosecurity procedures. So our goal is to control what can be controlled. We know HPAI is spread by direct contact between infected and susceptible birds that are potentially in close proximity. It can also occur indirectly through environmental contact with infectious virus in respiratory secretions and feces. And we know that domestic poultry may also become infected through direct contact and indirect contact with wild birds that have been carrying the virus. So it appears that oral exposure to the virus is a major route of infection, and how these birds are going to contract that potentially, like I talked about, maybe coming into contact with wild birds, but also through fomites. These fomites are inanimate objects such as vehicle tires, equipment, shoes, people coming and going. So farm to farm movement of these fomites has actually been regarded as a major cause of disease spread. And some data has also suggested that airborne feathers or dust particles can help spread this disease as well. We recently had a conversation with other state veterinarians who are dealing with HPAI, and they do believe that potentially the virus was spread from barn to barn via ventilation fans. So the barns were a fair distance apart, but the ventilation fans were blowing from the infected barns in the direction of the uninfected barns. So there is belief that this is one way that the disease can spread. So biosecurity. So our goals are bioexclusion. And what is bioexclusion? This is keeping the disease out of your flock. And protecting your flock from getting infected. You can see the little chicken flocks in the bubbles down there. Keep your chicken bubbles away from other people's chicken bubbles. And if that means, keeping personnel at a minimum, and feed trucks and litter trucks and that sort of thing at a minimum, then that's, what we need to do to help prevent the spread of this disease. Biocontainment, we're not going to specifically talk about biocontainment. When Rich-Ann gives her presentation next on response, she's likely going to cover how to protect everyone else's flock if your flock is infected. So how are we going to keep this virus from escaping? And we have to have a goal of protecting the public, protecting responders, protecting personnel who work on the farms because of the zoonotic potential of this disease. And then a goal that we all should have would be training all personnel on biosecurity concepts. So this slide here covers creating a biosecurity plan. And the biosecurity plan is a detailed plan to implement, monitor, and enforce to make sure all personnel are following protocol, standard operating procedure for coming and going. And that's going to be for personnel who work on the farm or folks who are delivering to the farm, that sort of thing. And the reason this is more of a high-level presentation is because procedures and protocols vary with every facility and the management on the facility. So when we're writing these plans, we have to consider what is the most likely pathway of transmission of high path AI in our area or in the area of the barn that we're writing the plan for, the most likely route of exposure. So the biosecurity plan, it really needs to be a carefully conceived, clearly written, and very situation-specific plan. And it needs to address the site-specific pathways for disease movement, identify critical control points within those pathways, and prioritize mitigation measures based on effectiveness and practicality. So I don't know how many have been to this website, poultrybiosecurity.org, but I just want to bring it up, and hopefully you can see that clearly. This is an amazing website. I find it so incredibly useful. And if you haven't gone through it, please go ahead. Yes, Richanne, did you have a question or a comment?
No, I was going to do a thumbs up, but that's not available here. Sorry.
Oh, okay. So this is really a wonderful website on writing a biosecurity plan, and it has checklists, a manual. You can download a template and write it, or you can actually type the plan right into the website here. You can do the premise map that Dave talked about in the secure food supply presentation as far as line of separation. It talks about line of separation, and then cleaning and disinfection information here. All of the logs that you would ever need to document all of your biosecurity practices are here, as far as visitor movements, truck movements, that sort of thing. And then you can download signage here. And then also there are videos for personnel to watch and can be well trained. But by going through this, you can print handouts. It's just an incredible, incredible website. And it will be on the post-webinar resources list that we'll send out in an email after the webinar. So hopefully everybody has a chance to take a look at that at some point as you're writing your biosecurity plans, and keeping your biosecurity plans up to date is going to be critical as well. So kind of the easy things to do right now to help prevent high path AI. We talked about biosecurity, biosecurity, biosecurity. What does that mean for the easy things that we can do? House all birds indoors. If they're not outside having contact with wild birds, then we're reducing potential environmental exposure that way. Rodent control and wildlife access into the barns, and keeping visitors to a minimum. We know that people can carry this disease on them. And so not allowing any unnecessary, untrained personnel into the barns, keeping a visitor log of who's coming and going, and following that line of separation. Cleaning and disinfecting any potential fomites, including yourself. And that means wearing PPE, which could be booties, a suit, changing your shoes, disinfecting your shoes, that sort of thing, changing your clothes, and then potentially showering before and after entering barns. When it comes to transportation, before allowing service vehicles like trucks, tractors, any tools, equipment, even some things that you use every day, like egg flats and cases that may have come in contact with birds or their droppings, perhaps they're being stored in an area that wildlife and wild birds have access to. Before they're allowed to exit the property, make sure they're cleaned and disinfected, they're decontaminated, that sort of thing. So we're not having potential disease leave the property. And disinfectant, as far as disinfectant, the EPA lists approximately 200 disinfectant products that are registered and labeled for the use against avian influenza A virus. Generally, these are recognized to be used on like a hard, non-porous surface. but they're used every day by the poultry industry to disinfect their facilities. The label will indicate if it's effective against avian influenza and what the application process should be. So that's something to really keep in mind, and making sure we're reading labels and making sure we're using appropriate disinfectants. And one that kills or inactivates the avian influenza virus is one we're after. So cleaning and disinfecting, and then knowing the signs of illness. Dr. Baldwin went through, potential signs of illness, including production parameter decreases and water consumption, feed consumption decreases, and then reporting. And we talk about biosecurity, but report. If it feels off or something doesn't feel right, none of the CDA veterinarians mind getting called in the middle of the night if something feels wrong. And then, of course, our number is listed here. And a veterinarian on call will give you a call back during the day. You're welcome to call us, CSU. And I know Dr. Beckett gave his cell phone as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out. We'd rather hear from you for a potential false alarm than hear from you before things get out of hand and it's too late. So I'm more than happy to answer any questions. Definitely willing to help anybody with a biosecurity plan. Feel free to reach out to the office.
Great. Thank you so much, Morgan. Really appreciate that overview. And I think it really drives home the point. You guys are all practicing biosecurity and daily biosecurity, but increasing and stepping up that biosecurity to secure food supply level is really the goal right now. So Dr. Lomkin is our final presenter. We've got just over 30 minutes left in our 2 hours that we allotted. And I think if there's a lot of discussion and questions, there's some of us that can certainly stay on after the 4 o'clock hour as well for some of those, and you can reach out directly. But Dr. Lomkin is going to give you all the information you need to know. If something goes wrong, here's what you need to do. Take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Glad you joined us today. And both Dr. Beckett and I have had quite a lot of experience working with high-path avian influenza as well as velogenic Newcastle disease. Dr. Beckett was one of the very first people to arrive in Iowa in 2015, and I was in the top 10 to arrive in Iowa in 2015. And so we got to watch that outbreak from the very beginning. So if you have questions, please do go ahead and type them into the chat, and Dawn can hopefully answer them as I go through this. So I'm going to just jump right in here. There are basically 2 scenarios that we see when doing these sick bird calls. And the first one is just that, a sick bird call. So a producer will call us and or a barn manager, backyard producer, somebody like that, occasionally a veterinarian will call us, and they're experiencing increased mortality, or in the case of a larger flock that has monitoring for these things, decreased water consumption, plus or minus decreased egg production and or feed intake. So in those larger flocks, you guys actually have a lot of production parameters that can really help you judge whether or not you're in the early throes of one of these diseases. And so do please keep an eye on that. Then we've got the routine testing scenario. So a routine testing scenario is where that NPIP testing that we were talking about happening at CSU, and they get some samples in and they test non-negative, and that's what we call it, non-negative, because it's not a true positive until it's confirmed at USDA's lab in Iowa. And we've had one of these in the past few years that happened at one of the large facilities, and it was routine testing, came back non-negative on 2 different barns. They were similar aged young chickens, and so then I got called out as a foreign animal disease diagnostician. So what I'm going to do is go through the steps of how I do these foreign animal disease investigations for a high-path avian influenza type call. And it's going to be in the first person because I'm going to be talking through it as if I'm the one out there doing that. Obviously, I'm not the only one in Colorado that would be doing these investigations. In fact, I'm in the far northeastern corner, so you guys over on the western slope, it would almost certainly be someone else other than me. But again, I've done a few of these, so I'm just going to go through it as if I'm the one doing them. So we get either a sick bird call or a call from CSU saying, hey, we've got a problem. And then that goes into the state vet's office as well as into Dr. Beckett at the USDA. And then they get together and decide who they're going to send out as a foreign animal disease diagnostician. It could be that it ends up being Heather or one of her staff for NPIP if they're closer and or have the time available to go do that. Most of the time then, or pretty much all the time, then we'll follow up with a foreign animal disease investigator, the veterinarian that works either for the state vet's office or for USDA. Occasionally, we may ask the facility to take some samples, and then we'll send a courier to pick those samples up and get them on their way to Iowa before a disease diagnostician can get there. It all is kind of dependent on what you're telling us you're seeing on the farm and what we need to do in terms of getting the fastest results possible. So I am going to, again, make the assumption that this call came in, a sick bird call, and I have been assigned to go out there and collect samples and ship them. First thing I'm going to do after I get assigned is I'm going to call you, the owner, farm manager, and ask you some questions. My very first question is going to be, how soon can we get this done? And this is a drop everything for me type situation where I'm going to drop everything and head your direction as soon as I get all my supplies put together. So I'm going to ask you how soon I can get on your farm, and that's hopefully as soon as I can get there. Then the next question is going to be, what biosecurity do you have in place on your farm? How am I going to get through that? Are you a shower in, shower out type facility? And that's fine. I can absolutely do that. I'll give you the sizes of what I need on the other side, and you can have the PPE ready for me, and I'll show up and we'll go on. If your biosecurity is different than that, then please just let us know, and we can deal with what you've got. If your biosecurity is less than what we need to establish for a foreign animal disease investigation, then I might park at the end of the driveway, set up my own clean dirty line, and work my way in that way. So everything will go faster / easier if I have an assistant in there helping me. That can be one of your people, or it can maybe be one of my people if I've got anybody available. And so a lot of times I'm kind of hoping that you'll have somebody available to help me. And the last one of these I did, the farm manager helped me and was terrific help, and it worked really, really well. In a couple of places, we probably could have used a third set of hands to just manage all the different sample supplies and everything that we're dealing with. But usually we can get through with 2 of us. I also need to make sure that I'm bringing on all the supplies that I will need to take the samples that I need, or that you've got those supplies, or it can also be a combination of the 2. I did have to go in on a foreign animal disease investigation on a hog farm with shower in, shower out, and they didn't want me to bring in any non-sterile instruments. So I actually had to stop at a vet clinic on my way there and get sterilized instruments because I don't have an autoclave, so I didn't have any sterilized instruments. So just depends on what level of biosecurity you have, what supplies you have on farm, and what I'm going to need. Once I get into the farm, I like to briefly sit down with the farm manager and the barn manager, ask a few questions. And again, I'm just going to run through these really fast. But if you have questions about any of them, go ahead and type it into the chat, and Dr. Beckett can hopefully answer them, or I can at the end. So first, we're going to talk about quarantine parameters, because as soon as this bird call comes in, you're under what we call here in Colorado a hold order. A hold order and a quarantine are extremely similar. The difference is, I'm not going to say it's semantics, but the difference actually is whether or not we have a true positive or a presumptive positive. If it's a presumptive positive, then you'll be under a hold order. If it's a true positive confirmed at NBSL, you'll be under a quarantine. So once that is confirmed, would change it to a quarantine. But for you, basically they're the same thing. That means that no animals nor animal products can be removed from that facility until we either release that hold order / quarantine or provide you with a permit to move a specific product or animal or something off. This also applies to things like tractors and other equipment that is working directly with the birds. So we'll talk about that. I want to make sure that you understand what is held, what can move off, which is basically just personnel, and commercial tractor trailers, and we'll talk about how they're going to be cleaned and disinfected to get off. And so we'll talk about that before I go in to start taking samples, just so that you understand. We'll also, again, discuss how we're going to get your employees off of the farm, because they probably will want to do that. We're going to then move on to what are you seeing on your farm? Why did you call this in? I probably already know some of it, but I want to basically get a brief but whole story from you. What caused you to have suspicion that you have a problem? How many barns do we have involved? Is there been a progression of barns, or did they all start at once? Those kind of things. I want to get a pretty solid understanding of that before I go on the farm, because I need to plan how we're going to move through these barns and do so in a very efficient but also progressive manner, so that, heaven forbid, I spread something between your barns that didn't need to be, and also so that I get the best samples that I can. We're going to talk about, has there been any feed or ventilation changes that may have precipitated this? Anything other than disease that may have precipitated the problems that you're seeing? Any thoughts that you have as to what you're seeing? Because a lot of times you're going to have the best gut feeling as to what's going on. And then if you have any questions, we'll go ahead and answer those. Again, I want that to be a brief introduction, but I also don't want you to, I just don't want to walk into the barn and start sampling birds and leave you with questions. You're probably going to come up with more questions while we're sampling the birds. Then again, like I said, if you have multiple barns, we're going to plan how we're going to do that. The first barn I want to walk into is the most recently ill barn, the one that we know we've got some sick chickens in, but this is the most recent barn to break. And I want to get some sick but not dying birds, and I want to get maybe some fresh deads out of there, or I might even ask to sacrifice a couple of ill birds, sick birds, so that we've got the absolute best sample that we can. If I sacrifice it right there and we get it immediately on ice, that's the best sample that we can send as far as a full necropsy. Then I'm going to want to move to the first barn that was affected. So the one that's been affected the longest. And again, I'm going to ask you questions based on the timeline of how did it move through this barn? How many deaths were, how much increased mortality did you have to begin with versus how much increased mortality you have now? What are your parameters? And I'm going to ask you to give me a printout of that if you've got it in your inventory system. And then, what's the original stocking density versus what I'm looking at now? If you've been removing the carcasses as they fall, and I'm looking at a half empty barn, was it 2/3 full when this started, or was it a full barn when this started and we've lost half of the birds out of this barn? Sometimes the way my mind works anyway, if I have that visual, it kind of brings the numbers home a little better to me. From that longest affected barn, then I'm going to sample a couple of live birds that aren't looking ill. So healthy live birds, if there are any left in this barn, I want to sample those birds. And then I also want to collect some samples from any fresh deads, actually maybe do a couple necropsies on those in that barn and a few other samples. So that's kind of my plan on how we're going to sample those birds. And again, this kind of depends on what's going on. If it was that just a non-negative off of routine samples and you really haven't seen increased mortality or any sick birds, we just have this non-negative hanging out there, then no, I'm not going to sacrifice any birds. I may go ahead and necropsy some if you've got normal mortality there, but we're going to really concentrate more on the oropharyngeal swabs, maybe some blood samples, maybe not, but definitely those oropharyngeal swabs. So as we're collecting those samples, we're going to need to be kind of keeping them organized. I'm splitting samples, so I'll be sending half to CSU for the absolutely fastest response we can get as far as what is going on, and then half of them will be going directly to our lab in Iowa and VSL so that they can get started on it as quickly as possible. We may do a courier all the way to Iowa by car, or if it's really, really bad, I may call Dr. Beckett and say, call in the jet. And we've actually got a jet courier system on contract. And so we'll have somebody pick up those samples from me, take them probably to whatever airport is closest, whether that be Weld County, Larimer County, DIA, whatever, and hand them to that jet company, and they'll literally put them on a jet and take them directly to Ames, Iowa. So that can happen too, just depending on how seriously we feel like it is. So again, we're getting those samples. Then, as I said, we might have a courier waiting outside the gate that'll just drop those samples into a bag that they've got there. We'll disinfect things as we go, trying to keep everything as clean as possible, and then they'll take off to get those samples shipped. And then I'll turn around and go back on the farm, and then we'll start talking about stuff. If, again, it's something that I'm out there and I'm going, yeah, no, this is really not anything scary, that I've seen nothing scary here. And that's more typical of those non-negative samples. Then I might be the one that ends up shipping those samples. So in that case, though, I'm going to have a little less time to spend with you because I still want to get those samples on their way right away. So what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and I'll take them, drop them at UPS on my way to Fort Collins to CSU, and so that they're going to arrive the next day at NVSL. I'll deliver them directly to CSU, and then I might just stop there at CSU, call you back so that when we can go over the rest of this stuff. But our best option would be to have a courier waiting outside the farm to go ahead and take those. Okay, so finally, I'm going to talk about, and I haven't been forwarding my slides. See, I've got in a hurry, but there we go. And I will put the outline of this talk on. I'm a little crushed for time here. So I'm going to put the outline of this talk on the materials that you will be getting directly from this call. So discussion points, I do want to talk about this a little bit because everybody keeps mentioning that I'm going to talk about it. So we're talking about it. So once the sampling is complete, then we're going to sit back down in the office and we're going to talk about stuff. The first thing that I want to talk about, because this is kind of my pet project, is what are we doing with carcasses? So what have you been doing with the increased carcasses that you're getting, the increased deads? So what have you been doing up to this point? Where are they? Have you been burying them? Are they sitting in a dumpster somewhere waiting for waste management systems to come pick them up? Or are you putting them in compost? What are we doing with these? And then thinking ahead, worst case scenario, and I'm going to bring the worst case scenario right up front and lay it out for you. And that's my technique. Other foreign animal disease diagnosticians might not do that, but if you want that worst case scenario, ask us for it. And even the ones that don't lay it out for you, we'll go ahead and go through it. But I'm going to lay it right out there and say, okay, what happens if this is high path avian influenza and we have to depopulate this? What is your plan for carcass disposal? And then we'll discuss that. Next thing I'm going to ask you is how much feed do you have on hand? And there's two reasons for that. The first reason is because, especially if you only have 2 out of 5 or 2 out of 20 barns affected, we don't want the other 18 barns, we don't want those chickens to go hungry while we're sitting around waiting for those 2 barns that have stopped eating to get those results, because that's not good. So do you have enough feed on hand to feed these chickens? until we get these results. And that might be tomorrow afternoon. It might even be the next day. But do we have enough feed on hand, or do we have to figure out how to get some more feed onto your farm safely using biosecurity methods? The other part of that is, okay, if we're going to come in and depopulate these birds, how much feed are we going to have left that will be considered contaminated that then we need to figure out how we're going to dispose of? So there's two ends of this question about how much feed do you have on hand. Do we have enough? Do we have too much? Need to know both of those answers. Next thing is employee concerns and questions. And we don't have to go through it in this order, obviously, because if you've got all your employees standing there, their time is up 30 minutes ago and they want to go home, we need to figure out how we're going to get them off the farm safely so that they're not fomites spreading whatever may be on your farm to other places. So if that's the case, we'll start there and work our way down for these other things. Inventory. Inventory is hugely important because, as someone said, you're actually only going to be paid for the chickens that are alive, not for the chickens that are dead. And so I need to know, while I'm there, how many chickens or turkeys or ducks or whatever we're talking about, how many do you have today? How many do you have on site today? Hopefully your inventory system can just spit that out in a spreadsheet and you can handle it to me. I've got 176,000 in this barn. This is my smallest barn. I've only got 85,000 in this barn, and so forth and so on. And then we'll each sign that inventory, date it, time it, and we're good with that. That might not be the final inventory that we use, but at least we've started that process. Again, I need the accurate numbers with documentation, not just a guess. So I think I've got, well, heck, I don't know. I think I've got 125,000, give or take 15,000 in that house over there. No, that's not going to fly. We need real accurate numbers. Also, we need the documentation of what kind of birds these are. That means type. So are they organic? Are they cage-free? Are they multiplier? Are they specialty? And then age. Have they been molted? So if these are layers, and I'm kind of going through this as if this is a layer facility based on the fact that that's the majority of what we have here, especially I have on my side of the mountains. But have they been molted? If so, how long ago were they molted? If not, were you planning on molting them? Those kind of things. And then breed or strain, because some of them are more expensive than others. So we need to know that. If you have purchase records for layers or sales records for other types of these birds, that may help when we're negotiating indemnity. Probably less so now than it did in 2015 because we've come up with other ways to figure out indemnity since then, but it certainly won't hurt to have those records available just in case, so that we do have all the information that is available to make these decisions on. Then we'll talk about depopulation. What depopulation options are for your farm. Hopefully you have all of this already figured out in your plan. And so this is all not surprise. So hopefully you have a plan, you know what equipment and personnel you need, and hopefully you already have it in place, because I can tell you from my experiences with high-path avian influenza in 2015, there were a lot of cases where unfortunately a lot of the birds end up dying of the virus because we did not have enough equipment to get in there to depopulate them humanely before they died from the virus. So hopefully you already got this. If you don't, then certainly we can try to provide it. We do have equipment in our national veterinary stockpile that we can get shipped out overnight. But if you have your own, that's better, because hopefully you also have personnel to go with it that know how to use it. Next is, how fast can we depopulate your facility? Let's think through it realistically. What process are we going to use to depopulate it? So therefore, how fast can we depopulate it? And how fast can we get those birds disposed of after we depopulate it? Because that's kind of an interesting question as well. And again, my experiences in Iowa make me a little bit sensitive to how fast can we get the chickens out of the cages after they're dead. And the farm that I was working on mainly in Iowa started out with 6.8 million layers. 99% of those birds died within a week from avian influenza before we were ever able to even get in there and start trying to depopulate. There was one barn that only about 50% of them died from the virus, and we actually had to depopulate. But most of the rest of the barns, the virus just wiped them out. And there would be one bird over here, one live bird over there, and the rest of them were all dead. And that is a natural disaster. Okay, disposal options for leftover feed, for eggs, for manure. We're going to have to talk about all of that. What is on the facility? What may have been what may have been exposed is the wrong word, but I'm not coming contaminated. What may have been contaminated that we need to talk about how we're going to eliminate the virus. Thoughts on how we need to eliminate the virus on your farm, and then and what you want to do, as well as restocking plans. So all these things are tied together. If you need to restock as soon as possible, you need to stay in business, you want to keep your people working, then, you know, when we're talking about virus elimination plans, then we need to think about the faster options as opposed to the slower options, which the faster options are going to be more personnel intensive and probably more expensive. So have to work through all of those options and make some compromises here and there to make everything work. And then maybe there might be other questions. And if you have other questions, please ask whoever is doing this with you, whoever's going through this investigation with you, because if we don't have the answers, we can at least write the questions down and get you an answer as soon as possible. And honestly, this particular moment in time might be the best time to get some of these questions answered, because if it is positive, things will move very, very fast from this point on. So take advantage of this time here. All right, that is all I have except for some pretty pictures. The one on the left is that's actually a wood chipper, a gigantic industrial wood chipper that they usually run great big huge trees through. We use that to go ahead and mix the 6.8 plus 300,000 pullets, so a little over 7 million birds with carbon sources, and it worked out great. It was beautiful compost when we came out of it. But then you have to clean that thing to get it off of the site, and that's the picture you're looking at right there. Is a contractor cleaning the wood chipper to get it off site so they can put it back into use as what it was designed for, which was chipping wood. The next one is a small backyard facility. I think that's in Oregon, and that was also high path avian influenza, and that's showing our people doing surveillance testing on backyards. And that actually reminds me of, I think that was we're almost done here. And then the exploding chickens out of the dumpster picture, which is just terrible. And then the compost. So these were all from Iowa. All right, so that is the end of my presentation. I will switch back. I will stop sharing and switch back here.
Right. Thank you so much, Rich Ann. That was a great presentation, and you went through that very quickly. So thanks for catching us back up on time.
You're very welcome.
For our veterinarians on the call, Becky just dropped the link for the CE certificate in the chat box. If you have problems finding the chat box, feel free to reach out to us and we can just send that to you directly. But fill in that the form on that certificate, and it'll automatically send you a certificate of attendance or a continuing education certificate. So just, a recap of, let me pause and see if there's any questions first, if anybody has any questions or any discussion right now. Okay, it's quiet, but if you think about questions and want to reach out, and we've all given our direct contact information. Just to recap, right now we're in a holding pattern. Oh, Dr. Dowds, go ahead. I think you'll have to unmute in the bottom of your screen. There's an option to unmute. I don't think we can unmute you. Or if you're on your phone, hit star, Becky, is it star 6 or star 5?
*6 on your phone.
Or 6 on your phone if you need to unmute. And Stephanie, thanks for that comment. We will be holding a webinar for backyard and small flock owners in the beginning of April, and we'll start circulating that information here, hopefully in the very near future. But just a couple of reminders. I mean, right now we're in a holding pattern to see what happens with the influenza outbreak. The biggest thing that we can do right now is biosecurity. So for our commercial producers, if you have not yet submitted your biosecurity plan to us for review for secure egg supply enrollment, do that ASAP. That is something that is going to be your ticket for continued movement if you do end up in a control area. So submit that to us, and we'll be happy to quickly review those and get them approved and sent back. And we can also provide any feedback. Working on site-specific plans, you've heard it in almost every presentation, is critically important, and that's something that we've learned. We've heard lessons learned from other state animal health officials, other industry members, USDA. The more we plan ahead of time, the more set up we are for success. And then monitor both observational surveillance, your production parameters, and always reach out to us if anything seems off. Just give us a call. You have a direct line to all of the folks that presented on the call, and we all communicate very, very regularly on this. And the last thing that I would ask is, if there are any, if there's any resources or any information that you guys need from us, please reach out directly. We are more than happy to have one-on-one conversations, have one-on-one meetings with our industry partners. We're going to be working on an exercise next week with our CDA and USDA team internally to make sure we have our logistics figured out. We'll invite our state EOC partners to that as well. But having industry and having our veterinarians at the table is going to be really, really important for a response effort. So, all right. And I do see we have one person off mute. Chuck, did you have a question or comment? Okay.
I'm sorry, this is Dr. Chris Lee of Foster Farms. I just wanted to say thank you to all you that put this together. It was very well organized, and I thought you guys did a really good job. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you guys being part of this. All right, Dr. Beckett, anything you'd like to say in closing?
Oh, I really appreciate everybody joining. I mean, the more and more we think about it, the more and more we talk about it, the better off we'll be. One of my lessons learned, and I think Rich Ann alluded to it from Iowa, is the more that you can do for yourself, the better off you're going to be. Resources will be stretched thin. It's your operation. If we use contractors, you and your people will take better care of your facilities than our contractors will. We do the best we can with our limited resources. But once again, the more that you control the process, the better off you're going to be. And I think you'll be back in business faster. If we looked at those Iowa and Minnesota farms and the ones who just turned it over to us versus the ones who were involved and influenced their operation or used their own people, I would probably say, and I'm Rich Ann, I'll say 30 to 60 days faster back into operation for those smaller operations. So anything we can do prior, be sure and reach out to us, and we will be more than happy to come evaluate your biosecurity, talk to you about the process, get you registered and done SAMs for indemnity. But we want to be as prepared as possible. We want to make sure all facilities are in eMERGE for emergency response. So just reach out to us and we'll do what we can to assist.
Great. And there was a question in the chat about organic certification. So, and that's regarding outdoor access for organic farms and organic certification. And I've coordinated with several folks on this. One is our organic program at CDA. So I have provided a memo for producers that have asked that indicates best biosecurity practices include restricting outdoor access and restricting access to the wild bird reservoir species at this time. So that will suffice for our organic certification program here. And that's also something that the third parties, as long as they have a letter from the state with that recommendation, they've been okay with that. Dr. Beckett, do you want to mention the USDA program real briefly? Because I know you just got that answer.
Organic's complicated, right? Because we have so many different organizations that do the certification. So the AMS National Organic Program has told their third-party certifiers they can waive the outdoor requirement. And so that AMS should have already given that to their participants. And we're asking third-party certifiers to suspend on-farm inspections in affected counties. So that's another thing. Once a place does get infected, then we won't do it anymore. We'll request not going on and doing the inspection for biosecurity. So, and then, and as Dr. Baldwin mentioned, a lot of those just require a state animal health official letter asking them not to do that outdoor access. But that, to me right now, based on what I've seen, what I've read, what I've heard from all the calls, that outdoor exposure to those wild birds is the primary cause. Almost all of them have been point incursions based on the genetics. I think we'll know next week. A little more specific on that, probably a report will be coming out.
So if any of you facilities have not received that letter yet from our office, if you need a letter, please feel free to reach out directly to me and I can send that to you. I already have it ready and can send it to you via email. So I'll also put my email address in the chat and we'll include contact information in the after webinar email that we send out as well. Any other final questions before we close for the afternoon? Okay, I'm not hearing any coming in. Thanks everybody for participating. We'll get that after webinar email with resources and links put together and really appreciate everyone's engagement in this.